Hey guys, it's Dare. Today I'm going to be reading the story Ticci Toby. I do not own the story, of course. It is made by Castaway. I'll try to put a link to the story in the description if I can. And yeah, so here we go. The long road home seemed to go on and on. The road continued to stretch in front of the vehicle endlessly. The light that shone through the branches of the tall green trees danced across the window in random patterns, and every once in a while, obnoxiously shining in your eyes. The surroundings were full of deep green trees, forming a forest around the road. The only sound was the sound of the car's engine as it traveled down the path. It was peaceful and with a serene feeling. Although the ride seemed like a nice one, it lacked every form of nice for its two passengers. The middle-aged woman behind the steering wheel had neat short brown hair and that fit her complexion quite well. She wore a green V-neck t-shirt with a pair of blue jeans. Diamond stud earrings decorated her ears, which partially shone from behind her haircut. She had deep green eyes, which her shirt brought out, and the lighting seemed to make them more noticeable. There wasn't anything significant about her appearance. She looked like any other average mother you would see on TV shows and the like. However, the one thing that made her different than average mother was the dark bags she had under her eyes. Her facial expression was gloomy and sad, although she genuinely looked like someone who smiled a lot. She would sniffle every once in a while and occasionally glance in the rearview mirror to look at her son in the back seat, who was hunched over partially, with his arms held tight around his chest and his head pressed against the cold window. The boy lacked any normal appearance, and anyone could plainly see there was something wrong with him. His messy brown hair went every which way, and the luminescence brought out his pale, almost gray skin. His eyes were dark, unlike his mother's, and he wore a white t-shirt with scrub pants that had been provided for him by the hospital. The clothes he had worn before were so shredded and blood-stained that they weren't wearable anymore. The right side of his face bared a few cuts along with a split eyebrow. His right arm was bandaged all the way to his shoulder. He had been shredded when the right side was hit with shattered glass. His injuries appeared to be painful, when in reality he couldn't feel anything. That was just one of the glories of being him. One of the challenges he had to face while growing up was growing up with a weird disease that caused him to be completely numb towards pain. Never before had he felt himself get hurt. He could have lost an arm and felt nothing. The other major disorder that he faced, which was the one that deemed him the many insulting nicknames in the short time he was attending grade school before he switched to homeschooling, was his Tourette's syndrome, which caused him to tick and twitch in ways he couldn't control. He would crack his neck uncontrollably and twitch every once in a while. The kids would tease him and call him Ticci Toby, and they mocked him with exaggerated twitching and laughing. It got so bad that he had to turn to homeschooling. It was too hard for him to be in a common learning environment with seemingly every kid poking or stabbing fun at him. Toby stared blankly out the window, his face empty of any emotion, and every few minutes his shoulder, arm, or foot would twitch. Every bump at the car tires hit would make his stomach turn. Toby Rogers was the boy's name. The last time Toby remembered riding in a car was when it crashed. That's all he thought about, and constantly replaying everything he remembered before he blacked out over and over again. Toby had been the lucky one. His sister had not been so lucky. When the thought of his sister came, he couldn't help the tears welled up in his eyes. The horrible memories were playing in his mind. Her screaming that had cut off when the front of the car smashed in. It all went black for a moment before Toby opened his eyes to see his sister's body, her forehead pierced with glass shards and her hips and legs crushed under the force of the steering wheel, and her torso pushed in from the too late inflated airbag. That was the last thing he had seen of his dear old sister. The road home continued on for what seemed like forever. It was so long to get home because his mom wanted to avoid the sight of the crash. When the surroundings gave way to the familiar neighborhood, they were both more than ready to get out of the car and step back into their own home. It was an older neighborhood with quaint little houses all next to each other. The car drove in front of a blue house with white window panes. They both quickly noticed the old vehicle that was parked in front of their house and the familiar figure that stood in the doorway. Toby felt automatic anger and frustration took over him at the sight of his father who wasn't there. His mother pulled the car up to the driveway beside him, turning off the engine, preparing to step out and face her husband. "Why is he here?" Toby said quietly, as he looked back to his mother, who reached to open the door. "He's your father, Toby. He's here because he wants to see you." His mother responded with a monotone voice, trying to sound less shaky. "If you couldn't drive up to the hospital to see Lyra before she died." Toby narrowed his eyes out the window. "He was drunk that night, honey. He couldn't drive." "Yeah, when is he not?" Toby pushed the door open before his mother stumbled out onto the driveway, where he met his father's gaze before looking down at his feet with a stern expression. His mother stepped out behind him and met her husband's eyes before walking around the car. His father opened his arms, expecting a hug from his wife. When she walked past him and put her arm around Toby's shoulder and started leading him inside. "Connie," her husband began in a raspy voice. "What, no welcome home, huh?" She ignored her husband's obnoxious words and walked past him with her son under her arms. "Hey, he's 16, he can walk by himself." His father began to follow him. "He's 17. Connie glared back at him before opening the door to the house and stepping inside. "Toby, why don't we get your room and rest, okay? I'll come get you when dinner's ready." "No, I'm 16, I can walk by myself," Toby said sarcastically. He glared back at his father before stumbling up the staircase and turning into his room, where he slammed the door violently. His little room didn't have much in it. Just a small bed, a dresser, a window, and the walls had a few picture frames of his family, back when they were a family, before his father became an alcoholic and acted violently toward the rest of his family. Toby remembered when he was arguing with his mom. He grabbed her by the hair and shoved her onto the floor. And when Lyra tried to break it up, he pushed her and hit her in the back corner of the kitchen table. Toby could never forgive him for what he did to his mother and sister. Never. Toby didn't care how much his father beated him down. He couldn't feel it anyway. What he did care about was how he intentionally hurt the only two people he cared about. And when he was waiting in the hospital where his sister took her last breaths, the only one that didn't rush to her was his dad. Toby stood by the window and looked out to the street. He could have sworn he saw something out of the corner of his eye, but blamed it on the meds he was on. When dinner time had come and his mother called to him, Toby came down the stairs and hesitantly sat down at the table across from his father and between his mother and an empty chair. It was quiet as the parents picked at their food, but Toby refused to eat. Instead, he just watched his dad with a blank stare. His mother caught on to his staring and elbowed him slightly. Toby looked over at her slightly, then down at his uneaten food, which he still didn't touch. Toby laid in bed. He pulled his covers over his head and stared out the window. He was tired. There was no way he could fall asleep. He couldn't. There was too much to think about. He had been debating on whether or not to follow his mother's directions and forgive his father, or to continue holding a grudge with his boiling hatred. He heard the door creak open and his mother padded into the room and sat next to him. She reached over and rubbed his back, which had been turned to her. "I know it's hard, Toby, trust me. I understand, but I promise it will get better," she said softly. "When is he going to leave?" Toby said with an innocent tone in his shaky voice. Connie let her gaze fall down to her feet. "I don't know, honey. He's staying as far as I know," she replied. Toby didn't respond. He just continued to look forward to the wall, holding his damaged arm near his chest. After a few minutes of silence, his mother sighed before she leaned in to kiss Toby and stood up and walked out of the room. "Good night," she said as she closed the door. The hours passed slowly, and Toby couldn't quit tossing and turning. Every time he let his imagination take over, he heard the screeching of tires, the screaming of his sister, and he would uncontrollably jerk in bed. He threw off his cover, lying on his back. He pulled his pillow over his face and cried into it. You could hear his own pitiful weeping. He would have been screaming and crying if he didn't press the pillow over his face. After a few seconds, he threw off the pillow of his face and sat up, hunched over, holding his head and breathing roughly, tears streaming from his eyes. He couldn't help but cry. He tried to keep it in, but he couldn't stop from whining and whimpering as he sat there shaking. He inhaled before he stood up and walked across the bed to the window and peered out, taking deep breaths, trying to calm down. He rubbed his eyes and looked out at the group of tall pine trees across the street. He stopped suddenly, and his gaze slowly centered on something standing under the streetlight. He heard ringing in his ears, and he couldn't look away. The figure stood beside the streetlight, about 2 feet shorter than it, his arms draped from his sides, and it staring at him with its non-existing eyes. The figure had no facial features to speak of, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, yet it held Toby's hypnotized stare, seemingly peering into his very being. The ringing in his ears grew louder and louder each second he stared before it. Suddenly, it all went black.